Good morning or good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world in this moment. And welcome to this first BRICS Data Protection and Digital Sovereignty Roundtable, an event that is organized within the CPDP LATAM, the Computers, Privacy and Data Protection Conference in its Latin American edition that we are organizing this year for the first time at FGV Law School. My name is Luca Belli. I'm professor at FGV Law School, where I had the Center for Technology and Society, and I will have the pleasure to be the co-moderator of this event together with Professor Min Zhang, who is professor at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and also a visiting professor at the CyberBRICS project of FGV Law School. Before we start this session, let me deal with some official tasks. We have an official disclaimer, I would like to read it so that we can then start the recordings properly. So let me stress that the comments made by FGV employees and guests during this online event and are only represent the personal opinion of both the FGV staff and guests, and they do not represent necessarily FGV institutional positions. We also reiterate that everyone that is participating to this event agreed to participate and is participating spontaneously, and with this participation is authorizing the use of their name, voice, and image, in addition to cede copyright related to the scan and exposure of this transmission, which will be made available later on FGV's official channel. To continue this transmission, we ask that all the panelists that we will now see on our full screen all together, so we would ask that all the panelists express their agreement with this thumbs up gesture that allow us to be sure that everyone here is participating freely and willingly and is aware of the recording of the session. Having said that, we can now finally start the session. This session is very interestingly merging two very key preoccupations, both of the larger CPDP LATAM community, but also of the digital policy and internet governance community. On the one hand, the protection of personal data, and on the other hand, the discussion of what does digital sovereignty mean. And there is an overlap between these two concepts. Of course, the concepts of digital sovereignty especially has very difficult meanings depending on your interlocutor and where you discuss this concept. If you discuss it in Beijing, in Brasilia, or in Brussels, you will have very different reactions in your interlocutors. And there are many sides and facets of this concept of digital sovereignty, and some of which overlap with cybersecurity, others with data protection, others with both. There are three main areas that we have identified with Professor Min Zhang when we were discussing the creation of call for papers that then will result in a book volume that we hope to launch next year, and to which we hope to have all the speakers of today participating. Speakers of today, of course, will present their contributions submitted for this project. And there are three main areas that we identified at the very beginning. The first one, of course, the most evident, is the one that interests data regulation. And when one discusses data protection and digital sovereignty, immediately is quite spontaneous to think about data localization and regulations of personal data that, on the one hand, aim at limiting international transfers of personal data in order to have further control on such data. On the other hand, aims at rebalancing a little bit the quite asymmetric relationship that we are now used to having developing countries and let's say the majority of countries in the world producing data that are harvested and then processed, and a lot of very lucrative processing takes place then in servers abroad, especially in the US or in other tech powerhouses like China nowadays. Now, on the one hand, this preoccupation of regulating personal data may evoke control. On the other hand, may evoke also a little bit of social justice in how the rewards of that processing are reaped and by whom. Then there is a very evident dimensions of infrastructure control, and this is very evident in one of the BRICS countries, Russia, where very explicitly the government has also approved a internet sovereignty law, and where the ambition to disconnect, if needed, the Russian segment of the internet is really concrete in not only in the plans and in the policy, but also in the system that the Russian government is aiming at implementing. On the other hand, this is also very evident in the plans that a country like China may have of the 1 trillion digital Belt and Road initiative that clearly aims at exporting not only regular infrastructure made in China, but connected infrastructure made in China. And so in this way, also projecting digital sovereignty somehow beyond the national borders. On the last dimension that, of course, it's pretty relevant is the dimension of services and how also content is regulated within services, how information is regulated within services. And this somehow overlaps with cybercrime or cybersecurity, especially in the very recent context of fake news and how foreign countries can meddle within domestic affairs by being able to orchestrate fake news campaign, and on the one hand, being able to analyze personal data abroad, on the other hand, being able to share and organize the circulation of so-called fake news. All these elements are of key importance for our democracies, for our economies, and for the self-determination of individuals. Now, today we have the very excellent opportunity of having some of the most renowned speakers and researchers analyzing these issues at the global level, but especially in the BRICS area. BRICS countries, a group of some of the most well-performing economies of the past decade, and whose projections are, even if maintained, even rosier for the next decade. They are usually considered for the economic dimension, but not for how their digital policies are impacting the rest of the world. Well, it is really time to start understanding that the digital policies of the BRICS countries are already having an enormous impact on the rest of the world, and will have an enormous impact at least in the next upcoming decade. And here today, we have this extraordinary opportunity to understand some of the nuances of how the BRICS countries' narratives on digital sovereignty and data regulation are being shaped. So to start the dance of today, I would like to invite my good friend, Sizwe Nile. He is the information regulator of South Africa and also professor at the University of Fort Hare, and last but not least, a board member of the CyberBRICS project that I have the honor to head here at FGV. So please, Sizwe, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Well, I guess it's evening from my side, but it's good morning on your side. But listen, um, I've been asked to do a keynote, and a keynote is usually not a presentation. I usually feel that a keynote should be a introductory talk into what is going to be discussed by the panelists coming forward. So obviously I'm from South Africa. We've had some very interesting developments in the last month or so. We've had the new data protection law kick into force from the first. We've also had the new cybercrime legislation signed into law. So it's been very, very exciting times from South Africa. But I'm not here to discuss South Africa. I'm here to discuss CyberBRICS, of which South Africa, I guess, is the head. In the BRICS, Brazil being there, Russia being there, India, and these are economies that are really very industrialized and have really dealt very well with the fourth industrial revolution, as well as really dealt with the challenges that we have been facing by the COVID-19 pandemic. It's really been amazing how one has had to move your entire bricks and mortar world into the digital world. And now we are faced with aspects of privacy. We are dealing with aspects of security. We have events like this conference of today. We are worried about not having people just hack into the event and spoil the event. But with that having been said, I think this session is going to be a very, very good session to talk about data sovereignty in itself. A lot of countries, a lot of internet users using data centers in foreign jurisdictions and therefore exposing their personal information as well as the security of their information to other people in other jurisdictions. So from the capital city of South Africa being Pretoria, I would like to wish the participants of this session very good luck. We are hoping there will be some peace and calm here in South Africa. We've seen what has been happening in the television, but that has not been stopping us from pushing forward in terms of our data protection laws and cyber criminality. So thank you very much for this opportunity to allow me to be the keynote speaker of the session. And I don't want to take much time for the other participants. Back over to you, Prof. Bailey in Brazil.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Cesar, for these opening remarks. It's always a great pleasure to have you with us. You are a good friend, an old friend of our CyberBRICS project here at FGV, and it's always a pleasure to count on you for our BRICS-related initiatives. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce the first speaker, Wangshu Kong from the European University Institute. She has authored an extremely interesting paper on draft paper at this stage on the spatial expansion of China's digital sovereignty, extraterritoriality, and geopolitics. So it's a great pleasure to have you here with us today, Wangshu. And then after your presentation, we will have some comments as a first exercise of peer review from Johannes Tumfau. Please, the floor is yours.
Hello. So thank you very much, Professor Bailey, for the nice introduction. Just to check, you can all hear me, right? Okay, I'll share my presentation through the screen. Okay, so yes, as the introduction says, so my paper is entitled "The Spatial Expansion of China's Digital Sovereignty, Extraterritoriality, and Geopolitics." The main argument of the paper is that we can observe from recent regulatory processes in China a kind of emerging shift toward extraterritoriality in regulating the internet and data flows, contrasting previous the characteristic of territoriality in China's approach. For example, we may think of data localization rule in the cybersecurity law. This shift toward extraterritoriality also indicates a more kind of spatially expansive notion of digital sovereignty. And here is the outline. So I'll pay attention to 3 recent regulatory instruments from which then I identify 2 approaches toward spatial expansion. Then I'll provide a brief analysis of this shift and finally conclude with a quick note on the contradictions that this shift will create for China. So these are the instruments that my paper had focused on. So the data security law, which was adopted about a month ago, then the draft law of personal information protection, and also the order issued by the Ministry of Commerce in January this year on blocking unjustified and extraterritorial application of foreign legislation and measures. So they're quite recent, and there will be more. My guess is there will be more development recent going on. So we have to keep an eye on that. So this paper identified 2 approaches toward extraterritoriality. So the first one is to sort of introduce extraterritorial rules explicitly in data governance legislation. So the first 2 instruments, the data security law as well as the personal information protection bill. And further, I divided this approach into 2 aspects. First, we can see both in the bill and also the law containing provisions which give them extraterritorial scope of application. And second, both instruments address the issue of cross-border data transfer. So without going into the details, it's just to say the 2 instruments sort of suggest that the data localization rule in the Chinese cybersecurity law is getting gradually loosened, and Chinese legislators are more actively thinking about cross-border data transfer. For this approach towards extraterritoriality, I also discussed 3 major internal and external conditions, and for the sake of the time, I'll just skip this part, but I list the conditions here. Regarding the issue of developing gradually a more liberal mechanism for cross-border data transfer, one thing I'd like to emphasize is that greater data mobility does not suggest the weakening of states' digital sovereignty. Rather, we know that greater data mobility relies on the sovereign power of the state to set up necessary regulatory frameworks. So it is not really a weakening, but adaptation of state sovereignty to the new condition. The second approach toward extraterritoriality is to block or counter certain foreign measures or legislation. I list here a provision from the draft law of the personal information protection. And just to sort of understand the extraterritorial impact of this provision, we may think about a potential question related to the European Union. So imagine that the EU decides that China's data protection framework is not up to EU's adequacy standard, and this might be interpreted as here discriminatory prohibition, which could then potentially trigger retaliatory measures. This is just one possible interpretation. As for the data security law, there is also a provision which actually covers much broader foreign measures that would trigger also reciprocal measures from the Chinese side. Here we can think of, for example, the Huawei ban or TikTok ban during the Trump administration. And indeed, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce has reacted those bans with measures very similar to, for example, blacklisting or export control. Closely related to this examples, then in January, the Ministry of Commerce issued this order to block so-called certain extraterritorial applications of foreign measures and legislation which are considered unjustified. And that blocking includes, inter alia, a prohibition order issued by the Ministry of so-called non-recognition, non-execution, and non-compliance. This order was widely interpreted in China as addressing the so-called secondary economic sanction by the US. And secondary sanctions has particularly broad extraterritorial effect and has always been very controversial in international law. So as it is controversial, then China did not have to invent a tool to block, but learn mostly from the European Union, who had already adopted blocking statutes against the US secondary sanctions. So the example listed here in the slide is the most recent one, which addressed the sanctions of Iran. So much of the blocking mechanism is sort of similar to the EU's blocking statutes. Here with blocking or countermeasures, they appear as this sort of defensive measures which may reinforce territorial sovereignty. But it is clear that these measures create extraterritorial consequences. They are particularly so-called other regarding. For example, with the blocking rules of the Ministry of Commerce, it applies to third country entities, forcing them to comply with China's the Chinese rule rather than, for example, the secondary sanction by the United States. So I would argue, although these measures look defensive, there's no contradiction between them and the spatial expansion of Chinese digital sovereignty. Now, a brief analysis, and many have two arguments. First, the expansion of digital sovereignty shows a greater integration of China's geostrategic interests into the notion of sovereignty. I mainly adopt a Marxist perspective here. So the spatial expansion of China's digital sovereignty is compelled by the growth of market share of Chinese companies overseas, and to maintain and to support private interests, then state power and state apparatus are always needed. And there's nothing surprising about it. The rich scholarship of Marxist approach to international law demonstrate this imbrication between private capitalist interest and state authority. And furthermore, from Marxist perspective about inter-imperialist rivalry, then economic competitions of countries would eventually lead to political and geopolitical clashes. And from this perspective, the spatial expansion of China's digital sovereignty demonstrates the rise into imperialist rivalry, which is inherent in the world capitalism. Meanwhile, closely related to the expansion of digital sovereignty is Xi Jinping's idea about a holistic notion of national security, which incorporates China's geostrategic interest. So in short, either from a Marxist perspective or just looking at the holistic notion of national security, we can clearly see the merge between the public and the private, and the internal and the external. And this reflects this spatial expansion of China's regulatory power and digital sovereignty. Meanwhile, there seems to be opposing trends in both the European Union and the United States, but only in relative terms of sort of shrinking extraterritorial jurisdictions. And for the sake of time, I'll skip this part, but just to say that the opposing trends essentially have the same logic as China's trends, i.e., so the regulatory scopes have to be compatible with one's geostrategic interest. The second argument I made in the analysis is that in this particular context, we can observe geopolitical confrontations through regulatory emulation. And I mentioned earlier, China was learning from the European Union and the United States to develop its extraterritorial rules. Usually when we think about regulatory emulation, we think about different states learn from the model to adopt a similar standard, which then would contribute to regulatory harmonization. In this case, with China's emulation, we probably don't have such a rosy picture, but rather we see how foreign regulatory models can be used by China to empower itself in the geopolitical struggle. This will likely to perpetuate the confrontation rather than resolve it. Finally, there are important difficult contradictions within China's shift toward extraterritoriality. So huge contradictions exist between the push toward extraterritoriality and China's own history that foreign colonial powers established extraterritorial regimes in China for almost a century. So from that history, China has always claimed to adhere to the principles of sovereign equality and non-interference and perceive itself as anti-hegemonic. So then how to project one's regulatory power abroad and still present oneself as anti-hegemonic, and how to really maintain some credibility in China's claims or protest against foreign intervention, and that would be crucial questions for policymakers and lawmakers. Finally, just to conclude, so this paper argues that there is an emerging trend toward extraterritoriality and the more spatially expansive notion in digital sovereignty in recent regulatory processes in China. This trend evolves in tandem with the market share of Chinese companies and China's geostrategic interests. And to some extent, this trend is a result of regulatory emulation, which seeks to counterbalance the unilateral global reach of regulatory hegemons. And this trend has its own contradictions and is likely to be self-defeating. That's my final analysis. So I'll leave it here. I very much look forward to Johannes' comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Wanshu. Really fascinating analysis, and it's really interesting to read your paper and how you connect the dots between the various facets of this, to one extent, explicit, but also to another extent implicit digital sovereignty strategy that is deployed by China. And now I will immediately give the floor to Johannes for his comments so that he can help also the peer review of this submission.
Many thanks, Wanshu. That was a great paper. I think it's really interesting when you read all of the papers, you find these notions of digital colonialism, digital sovereignty, and digital imperialism. There's also this notion of weaponized interdependence, which suits also very well in that debate. And you're talking about inter-imperial rivalry. Yes, also interesting that you take one of the basic assumptions of liberalism in international relations, that regulatory emulation leads to peace and is a positive process. You read that in the other way and it turns into a violent process, especially when that kind of regulatory emulation is a tit-for-tat solution. Also, you show the classical imperialism, classic imperialist critique can be of value today, particularly when we think of China, where the private and the public sector are really closely intertwined, which was really one of the historical features of imperialism. Nevertheless, that would be my first question. We need to ask, like, how far does this historical analogy really go? Like, how far is historical imperialism comparable to data imperialism? And I think there's a big difference there because data is a non-rival good, right? In a sense, at least essentially. Control over data is not the same as having control over a gold mine. It does not have like that same immediate economic impact. So that would be one interesting difference here. I think also what you maybe could think about is to read a little bit or the norm literature of Finnemore and Sicking and those people, norm development processes. And there's some rather interesting new paper in the telecommunications policy that just came out about normfare. I think that plays a huge role here, like how the development of norms can be understood as almost a means of warfare. Another issue that is rather fundamental is Mueller, right? Will the internet fragment? In that book, he comes up with the internet jurisdiction paradox, the cyberspace jurisdiction paradox, he calls it. He says, whenever you want to exert jurisdiction over cyberspace, you will always end up undertaking extraterritorial measures. And so I think that's a very important point, because if you think of that, then you see, can there be actually a turn towards extraterritoriality? Can there be like a sudden shift? And I would doubt that there's a sudden turn towards extraterritoriality in that sense, and especially in other fields. If you look at Chinese policies in other fields, for example, extraterritorial persecution of Uyghurs. I think my presentation shouldn't be there yet, but if you look at those things, as recently happened in the embassy in the Belgian embassy in China, or also the persecution of Uyghurs in Pakistan, then you see that China was very active in extraterritoriality for a long time in a political sense. And also what I will talk about, the SCO, right, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, there is also a regional regime of data exchange of e-evidence, so that also has a great amount of extraterritoriality that's already established. There comes the term extraterritorial enforcement. You use the term, and I think it's a difficult term. I know it's used in the literature, but from an international law perspective, extraterritorial enforcement jurisdiction is like per se illegal, right? This means a policeman is going to another jurisdiction and kidnapping someone and enforcing the law. So I think that's something which shows also some way how this digital age could be different from pre-digital ages, because this extraterritorial enforcement of regulations like the Cloud Act or the GDPR will always be based on consent, or it will be based on economic power. And then that economically powerful states have like power beyond their borders is actually quite a natural process, but it's not necessarily regulatory. And so those are more or less the point that I would come to. You at the end, you say the best solution would be self-restraint and mutual respect to avoid a vortex of tit for tat between rivals. Very nice idea, but probably when we think of Muller, it's difficult because you have the cyberspace jurisdiction paradox. So to like stay within your territory is probably not even a solution when you think of cyberspace regulation. Thinking of the destination approach, the data controller approach, the origin approach, those all have extraterritorial aspects. So, but I leave it for that, and I hope that was somehow helpful.
Thank you very much for the very detailed comments. I'm not sure if we have time. I mean, if you have any very fast and telegraphic reply, otherwise we can have it now. Otherwise, I would suggest to have the replies at the end, so that we allow everyone to expose and receive feedback before we open for a final royal rumble of comments and replies. So I would suggest now to Johannes to go with his paper. So Johannes Turnpart, that just provided this very good and detailed commentary on Wanshu's paper. He is researcher at the Law, Science, Technology and Society Center at the Free University of Brussels. And he authored a very interesting submission on cultures of digital sovereignty in the SCO members, SCO being the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, of the SCO member states, China, Russia, and India, beyond political and technological determinism. Please, Johannes, the floor is yours. I think your mic is muted. And now again.
Thank you. Now can you see my presentation or not? Are you seeing it? Okay. I'm talking about cultures of digital sovereignty in China, Russia, and India, and the subtitle is A Comparative Perspective from NWICO and WICISS to SCO. I will explain in a bit what these abbreviations mean. So the SCO, what is the SCO? That's the Shanghai.
Sorry, I can't see the presentation.
You cannot see it. That is bad. Yeah, why is that? Now I think you can.
Now we can see it.
Yeah?
Yes.
So, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, what is that? That was established in 2002 in the context of the Chechnya conflict, the Yugoslav wars, and the color revolutions. And its aims are to prevent Western interference and to fight regional Islamist terrorism. Members are China, Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and since 2017 also India and Pakistan. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is interesting regarding digital sovereignty because it's pursuing an agenda of digital sovereignty since the Statement on International Information Security in 2006. It also includes, as I said before, a transnational data exchange regime regarding suspected terrorists. From a Western perspective, of course, those people might be dissidents within the so-called regional anti-terrorist structure. The SCO is also interesting because it uttered a repeated concern for cultural integrity versus Western cultural hegemony. For example, in its International Code of Conduct for Information Security from 2011, it criticizes the, quote, use of information and communications technologies that incites terrorism, secessionism, or extremism, or that undermines other countries' political, economic, and social stability, as well as their spiritual and cultural environment. So why is this relevant to BRICS? It's relevant to BRICS because, of course, digital sovereignty is to be discussed within BRICS, and the majority of BRICS members now are also members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And Brazil and South Africa are comparably Southwestern and comparably liberal compared to the SCO states. Of course, that is quite difficult right now with the situation in South Africa and also with the situation in Brazil. Maybe that could be a weak point, but that's more a constitutional idea, and you will see where it comes from. So now a short note on the international origins of digital sovereignty. The debate about sovereignty and communication comes from the NWICO, that's the New World Information and Communication Order. Those were debates that happened even in pre-digital times between 1976 and 1980 at the UNESCO. And they were led by the non-aligned states. Those were states that were neither part of the Eastern nor the Western Bloc, and they were arguing against the Anglo-Saxon doctrine of the free flow of information. India was among the leaders, and it was supported by China. The aim was to establish sovereignty over communication and to decolonize information. They were demanding plurality and multi-directionality of global communication. In 1984-85, the US and the UK left UNESCO due to such projects which they criticized of having an anti-Western bias. They would then rejoin later. Later, there's a comparable initiative in the digital sector, the WSIS, the World Summit on the Information Society, that happened from 2003 to 2005. And the prime sponsors were Brazil, Cuba, and Iran, supported by China. They had similar aims regarding digital issues, among others, putting ICANN under international control. Also here, US diplomatic pressure ended the debate. Now, let's look at the national approaches to digital sovereignty within the SCO. In China, you have the debate about digital sovereignty from 1998. The scholar Weng Xianggong of the School of Journalism and Communication of Beijing University, he's updating the NWICO debates to develop a notion of digital information sovereignty. The aim is to protect Chinese cultural identity against global Coca-Cola culture, he writes. And in 1999, you have the crackdown on the religious group Falun Gong and their extraterritorial websites. They have, for example, websites in Canada, Australia, and so on. And there you see how practices of information sovereignty turn into digital censorship. That is later extended to issues related to June 1989, Tibet, and the Uyghurs, and that is the beginning of the Great Firewall. At the same time, other theorists develop a strategic notion of network sovereignty that compares control over digital territory to control over land, air, and sea. And those Chinese positions resonate very well with the WSIS, about which I was talking before. So in Russia, you had a comparably liberal internet before the Duma election protests in 2011, which were the biggest protests the country has seen in its post-Soviet history. That is followed by heavy internet restrictions between 2012 and 2014. There's, for example, the law against gay propaganda, against blasphemy, and even obscene language. And particularly the prohibition of blasphemy marks a cultural shift from Soviet secularism. Such measures are justified, for example, by the ultra-nationalist think tank Izborsk Club, which is close to Putin, as a defense against Western attacks on Russia's faith, culture, and historical codes. Another important factor are, of course, the Snowden revelations. In 2013, that sovereign internet debate starts, about which Luca was also talking in the beginning, and we also have a paper by Francesca and her colleagues about that. And in 2015, you have the data localization laws, and in 2019, the RUNET has been successfully disconnected from the global internet, as has been also said in the beginning. So let's look at India's digital sovereignty. India's digital sovereignty is slightly different than the others because it's the world's largest democracy. Nevertheless, Freedom House ranked India in 2021 as partly free. India is a digital decider regarding digital sovereignty. It has the world's largest biometric system. About that, Revati will talk about that later on with a biopolitical approach, which is really interesting. India why is it illiberal, or why has it non-liberal aspects? Because it's #1 in internet shutdowns. 2020, for example, there were 155 internet shutdowns globally, and 109 of them in India. It also enacted the world's longest internet shutdown in Jammu and Kashmir between August 2019 and March 2020. That is all based on the temporary suspension of telecom services rules from 2017. Cultural issues also play a role in the government's justification of these shutdowns. For example, the prevention of mob violence, which is often interreligious, and of Islamic terrorism in Kashmir. Also, the prevention of WhatsApp lynchings play a role. Those are lynchings that happen quite frequent in India. They are due to rumors on WhatsApp and happening primarily in rural communities. In 2021, India also banned 59 Chinese apps after border skirmishes. So that is interesting. We see this great degree of multipolarity and conflicts within the SCO. And so we can ask, is India's anti-Chinese digital sovereignty a sign for extreme multipolarity within the SCO? The key takeaways are other BRICS members, South Africa and Brazil, they could act as advocates for a liberal rights-based approach to digital sovereignty within BRICS. Or they could become entangled with the SCO's digital transnational authoritarianism. That's how Tsurapas has called it in a 2020 paper. The BRICS group could avoid the charged subject of culture and collaborate in culturally neutral projects regarding digital sovereignty. For example, with BRICS Coin and BRICS Cable, which was also one time a project that was started but then not concluded. Positive aspects of the SCO members' position on digital sovereignty are such ideas could contribute to a more pluralistic digital culture. The keyword would be NWICO 2.0. as coined by Tusu in 2015. From a philosophical point of view, we can see that technological determinism is wrong and that cultural values matter when it comes to regulations of digital environments. Yes, thank you very much. That was it with my presentation.
Thank you very much for this very detailed presentation. Another fascinating contribution to the book, really detailed, and I really like the fact that you also provide a lot of empirical evidence to support the argument that you expose in the paper. And now I will let Wangshu provide some key comments on the paper.
Sure. So thank you very much to Johannes for the presentation. It was a pleasure for me to read Johannes' paper. I worked with Johannes on other projects before, and relatively I was familiar with Johannes' work. It's quite nice to see how ideas and thoughts and projects are evolving, and many of them are actually quite useful for my own work too. So just also a big thank you for to Professor Wei and Professor Jiang for the organization. So as I told Johannes before, I think the paper can effectively be being extended to a book project, which would give more room for a proper, say, historiography of digital sovereignty traced back all the way to supposedly the end of the Second World War, and also give more room for comparative analysis. Given the space of a single paper, then the difficulty of stretching and then jumping across different time and the spaces is quite obvious. And I think Johannes did a great job to show the longer history and also the complexity of digital sovereignty within not just the BRICS, but more particularly the SCO countries. So I have a couple of comments. I'll send the comments by email, but I'll just pick a few just for the sake of time. So the first comment, so at the beginning, I think it actually, it makes sense that Johannes actually didn't mention it in the presentation. So at the beginning of the paper, then Johannes claimed that the story that this paper wants to tell is that the concept of digital sovereignty within SCO countries differs significantly from the concept of digital sovereignty within the non-SCO countries, i.e. Brazil and South Africa. So for Brazil and South Africa, then digital sovereignty revolves more around issue of economic issues, whereas for SCO countries, there are also questions of political culture. Then just by looking at claim, I was expecting part of the paper would also include a kind of detailed comparative analysis between SCO countries and the non-SCO countries in terms of how digital sovereignty is perceived and put in place through policy. But it seems that actually the whole paper itself is more focused on actually the three SCO countries. So a small comment would be maybe just to change that introduction slightly. That would also set the expectation of the reader more like in track with the paper. So another comment. So a couple of comments actually had already been shared with Johannes before. So the section 2 of the paper was essentially about what digital sovereignty opposes to, and the answer Johannes gave is technological determinism. So as framed like this, I'm not completely convinced that digital sovereignty is primarily opposed to technological determinism. And then indeed, Johannes also discussed later in section 4 on China's approach to digital sovereignty, that Marxism can also be considered as an account of technological determinism. Although within Marxist studies, then the issue of determinism can be further complicated. So what this means for section 2 is that digital technological determinism would be probably a too broad term to cover what digital sovereignty is against. Then we also have to ask the question, so to determine what is the object that is to be determined. So indeed, the rest of the section 2 suggests it is the deterministic belief in liberal democracy being brought about by internet, a kind of also end of history kind of narrative. That is highly problematic from BRICS perspective. So it is true in the case that China, the triumph of liberal democracy would be the object that digital sovereignty opposes, but we can't say that to other countries, for example, Brazil, South Africa, or India, it's the same case. So what would be more generalizable as the object that digital sovereignty as a discourse would oppose? Then why not just choose some more sort of buzzword like, technological for example, digital hegemony or digital imperialism or colonialism instead of technological determinism. So a final comment, I'll be very quick, is about culture. So I agree with Johannes that culture seems to play quite an important part in this country's discourse and practice about digital sovereignty, and it's absolutely necessary to study them. I also agree that in current debates about digital sovereignty, culture seems to be relatively understudied. However, I'm not entirely convinced by how culture is dealt with in this paper. So there are points where culture is discussed independently, for example, with the New World Information and Communication Order. But to me, it would be at least incomplete to talk about culture independent from economic and geopolitical conditions. For example, with the New World Information and Communication Order, it has close relationship to the new international economic order. So the issues of material conditions, distribution of wealth, ownership of technology, control of tariff and patent, etc., etc. All these are actually highly relevant issues for in the debate. And there are also some places in the article where so highly complicated situations are discussed, for example, with Russia or India. And then Johannes discussed indeed multiple factors ranging from domestic or national security to geopolitical situations to history, etc. And then culture all of a sudden was singled out and with a line saying essentially like, oh, there is a clear link or a clear reference with culture or cultural value is actually important here. Then I would wonder, okay, what kind of constitutive role is played by culture? So how is culture interacting with other factors, for example, economic or geopolitics or history? So so why not? What about would there be any discussion about how culture is related to, for example, particular conception of freedom of internet or freedom of speech or right to privacy? So that would be my comment for now. I will share the full comments through email with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wang Shu, for these very detailed comments as well. And now it's time to hear from Venkatesh Hariharan from the Open Invention Network about his paper on digital sovereignty through payments infrastructure, a case study of the National Payments Corporation of India. And after this, I will let my friend and colleague, Professor Min Yang, keep on with the moderation of this session. Thank you very much. Please, Venki, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luca. I am very happy to be presenting this along with my colleague Saryu Natarajan from the Apti Institute. When Saryu and I were discussing what paper to submit for the CyberBRICS, we looked at different aspects, but it seemed like the payment ecosystem in India was reasonably mature, and that may be an ideal case study. And Luca, can we have the presentation? The first slide. Yeah, and payments are the lifeblood of any economy, and therefore they play a very, very important role in an ecosystem. And the role of payments and the importance of digital sovereignty with respect to payments came out very sharply when in 2014 the US imposed sanctions against Russia. What happened is that MasterCard and Visa controlled almost 90% of all the credit card transactions in Russia. So millions of Russian credit card accounts are frozen. This forced Russia to create an alternative credit card called Mir. And now they are trying to compel payment networks to register
Hi, Luca. It looks like Venki dropped off the internet.
We lost Venki. So I think we lost Venki. So I think I suggest maybe we go on with the next paper. So please, the floor is yours, Min.
Yeah, thank you, Luca. For now, let me introduce our next speaker. If Venki, get back onto the internet, we will have him present his paper. So our next speaker is Vashishtha Doshi, who is a doctoral student of political science from UC Santa Barbara. His paper is co-authored with Henrique Delgado, a doctoral student from the University of Denver. Their co-authored paper is titled Grounding the Digital Statecraft of Middle Powers Within Domestic Stakeholders. Vashishtha, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Chang. I will, can everybody see my screen or not yet? Oh, great. Okay. Hello, everyone. Our presentation is tentatively titled Digital Statecraft of Middle Powers. And we are doing an exploratory study of the tech landscape and digital sovereignty in Brazil and India. It's written with my partner, Enrique Esteves Delgado, who is a PhD student at the University of Denver. So the first, we have two central questions that we're trying to address in this paper. The first one is, what agency do middle powers have in a weaponized interdependence world to safeguard their sovereignty? Pretty much, we know through the groundbreaking paper of Farrell and Newman that there is a single hegemon in the world of technology, and that's the United States. However, literature on middle powers have told us that middle powers have somewhat of an agency when it comes to being under a hegemonic system. So we're trying to figure out what is the agency middle powers have especially in the tech scene in an interdependence world. And then the second question is why and how does domestic politics structure the outcome of this available agency? Having an agency is not enough, but can you exercise this agency is the second question that we're sort of trying to decipher in this paper. We're using the case study of differences in data localization policies between Brazil and India to sort of illustrate our argument. The structure of we try to answer this question sort of in three formats, right? First, we set up the argument that firms is how great powers weaponize interdependence in the fields of finance and digital technology. American hegemonic power extends throughout the world, not because just of American public institutions, but rather American private corporations. And the second is, well, there are variables along which middle powers can attain autonomy in the fields of finance and digital technology. So we looked at finance very briefly to show that similar things exist for technology. The focus is not on finance, but it's on technology. Finance is sort of, we just use that as a overlap. The final thing that we're trying to, we try to answer this question through is, what are the range of policy outcomes varies amongst the middle powers because of the constraint and opportunities that emanate from the domestic politics. So we're grounding digital statecraft within the worldview of domestic politics. This is very standard IPE formats. And we are using these standard IP formats to sort of answer how a economic statecraft or digital statecraft of a middle power is constrained. So first, we're going to go briefly over what are the similarities between US hegemony in finance and technology. And in finance, we know that American hegemony extends through a set of public institutions like the SWIFT, the repo facilities, the correspondent banking accounts in the US, and through private activities such as stock market exchange groups, passive funds, banking, interconnected balance sheets of banking groups. And we're arguing that a similar way US hegemony extends in the world of technology. And in the world of technology, the centrality of US firms is preeminent. A huge fraction of the global data traffic is channeled through servers of a handful of US companies. there are some estimates that around 70% of the global web traffic goes through servers located in Northern Virginia, close to Washington, D.C. So the centrality of US in the technology space is through mostly its firms. And so how does US firms work, right? US firms basically act as appendages of US power. We have seen this, just briefly, as Venki was talking about how MasterCard and Visa, the United States government was able to pressurize MasterCard and Visa to effectively bar payments in Russia. So what we're saying is we're sort of making this an extension, saying the US firms act as appendages of US power. The Snowden leaks have showed us, how the US utilizes its dominant position in the world of its internet firms to conduct mass surveillance. And this kind of high international market dominance coupled with US jurisdictional authority over domestic firms allows the US to internationalize its state power. And we've seen this in the Farrell and Newman piece that they talk about. The US weaponizes interdependence in basically two manners: the panopticon effect and the choke point effect. Briefly, the panopticon effect talks about US surveillance, meaning the US sort of is able to glean into the entire systemic network of technology and finance. And the choke point effect is the US is allowed to sort of pressure those choke points to cut a third party off from the network. In finance, it's very clearly evident through the SWIFT banking system, through the SWIFT network. It's also evident through what Venki was initially just talking about, was through MasterCard and Visa. The prevalence of MasterCard and Visa in the world allows the US to create a sort of choke point effect, pressure Master and Visa, and your entire world's payment system, your third party's payment networks just collapses, right? And so this is what we're looking at as the panopticon and the choke point effect. Now, within this, the constraints and opportunities exist for middle powers. So we're looking at middle powers as a, Wallerstein talks about these as semi-peripheral countries. We're not talking about that in very dissimilar terms. Basically, they're in a subordinate relationship with the hegemon, but they have significant market dominance in their home countries. And so they are able to gain some policy space where they're able to sort of block effects onto themselves, but they're not able to extend effects onto others. This is the first, so if you consider power as a dual-faced system, and Cohen 2019 talks about this, is that power has two faces. One is autonomy, and the other is influence. Autonomy is sort of able to block effects onto yourself, and then influence is able to effect onto others. And so we're arguing that middle powers have a power to block things onto themselves, hence the notion of autonomy. And so we're focusing on the notion of autonomy that middle powers have, or the agency to execute this autonomy. We look at what middle powers have done in the field of finance, and then what they can do in the field of technology. So in finance, Armijo and Katada have this giant book where they talk about how middle powers have used something called defensive economic statecraft, using capital-controlled state-owned banking system, foreign currency reserve accumulation, issuing low or no foreign currency debt. All these variables have allowed them to gain a measure of autonomy vis-a-vis the international financial system. We're arguing that in technology, certain variables exist, just like in finance, for middle powers to gain some autonomy. And they range from data localization, global navigation satellite systems, blocking access to US firms in home markets, indigenizing the clouds. And these are just some of the variables. We're not going through an exhaustive list, but sort of an explanative list of what agency or what variables middle powers can have to execute measures of autonomy. And we think of autonomy as sort of a gradation, right? It's not 0-1, but rather a sliding scale. Finally, we argue that we're going to look at one such variable, and that's data localization. We argue that data localization now forms the heart of global information geopolitics. And why is that so? So we say that data localization, what does it effectively do? It physically shifts the data from the US to the home country. What that does is it jurisdictionally shifts the data. Along with the physical shifting of data, jurisdictional shifting of data occurs. What then happens is that data is now governed by local laws because jurisdictionally it falls within the territory of the home country. This allows the home country to sort of minimize the effects of US extraterritorial reach by because data is physically located in the country, the laws of that particular country are supersede over extraterritorial laws. And therefore, data localization then acts as a measure of autonomy that countries can use to gain a variable of autonomy that countries can utilize. Data localization severely limits or removes the ability of the US state to block access to data generated by the countries themselves. So if you are implementing data localization policies, effectively the data is under your jurisdiction. So even if at some given point of time, there are some sanctions or there are some legislations, extraterritorial reach of the US law, home countries can effectively block them because they still have the data stored within their territory. The key mechanism through which the choke point effect works, states' capacity to limit or penalize the use of hubs by third parties, becomes limited because of the jurisdictional control over the hubs of information through data localization. And so putting in this generalized economic term, the US would still able to access the flow of information. So if your particular home country is swamped majorly by US big tech firms, the US would still be able to access the flow of data. So the panopticon effect of the US would not be diminished, but the data localization policies would at least limit the access to the stock of data, thus curtailing the choke point effect. And we have seen this happen that in fact, the Chinese have been sort of thinking around this format, around this choke point effect, when they asked Apple to localize data within China on a cloud that is owned by Chinese state-owned enterprises with the keys where the Chinese government has access to the iCloud keys, right? So this is not thinking in abstract, but the Chinese government has sort of thought about this. Now we're going to look at the similarity between Brazil and India's tech landscape. One of the critical differences that IP literature brings about is that if there are differences in interest groups, you will see differences in regulatory and institutional outcomes. So first we have to show that the differences in interest group between Brazil and India in terms of material interests are not that different. If you look at, we divided India's and Brazil's tech landscape into core, intermediary, and customer facing. Effectively, they both look similar. There is a very big presence of American big tech firms at all levels. And then there's a very competitive consumer startup culture in the customer facing level. So then our question becomes, well, if Brazil and India have similar interest group structure, material interest group structure, shouldn't their data localization policies be the same? And here we observe that they're not, right? India has a sectoral fragmentation data localization policies. So, India has data localization in payment systems data, subscriber data, insurance policy data, even draft e-pharmacy regulations and draft national e-commerce policies talk about data localization. In Brazil, however, we see that there is no data localization in its LGPD. Right, but Brazil affirms that it has the right to have extraterritorial reach to its national data stored abroad. So our question then becomes, well, if they have the same material interests, and if both countries understand that data localization is one variable around which you can gain a measure of autonomy under digital hegemony, then why don't they have similar policies? And so we've looked at our central focus is on independent institutions. So during the data localization negotiations, the Brazilian Congress negotiated comprehensively for unitary law, and then it expressed jurisdictional authority over the regulatory agencies and other sectoral institutions. The Brazilian Congress basically subsumed the interest of Brazil's independent institutions and usurped it to craft a unitary data law, right? In India, however, that did not happen. The parliament did not usurp the remit of different agencies like the IRDAI, the Reserve Bank of India, the e-commerce, the Ministry of Commerce, the Competition Commission of India. The remit of these agencies was not usurped by the Indian parliament within a singular framework. And so we're saying the exogenous effect of independent institutions in India allowed for a sectoral fragmentation, right? So within a digital hegemony, India was still able to carve spaces for itself. And that was because of its independent institutions. So our concluding remarks focus on four things. In a world where great powers internationalize state power through their firms, there are still key policy choices available to middle powers that could enhance their autonomy and hence sovereignty. Data localization is one such autonomy-inducing policy choice. It's not the only one. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition, but it is one variable around which middle powers can gain some autonomy. However, the data localization policy is not enough. Having that power is not enough. Domestic politics has to align in a particular way to enact them in a meaningful digital statecraft. And our novelty of our argument is that under a weaponized interdependence world where there's a single digital hegemon, middle powers face two constraints. Of course, the international sphere under digital hegemony, where their actions are limited, but also the domestic sphere, which eventually determines whether they actually have an autonomy-seeking digital statecraft or they do not have an autonomy-seeking digital statecraft. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Vashishtha and Henrique, for your co-author paper, for raising the question of the positionality of middle power countries in the shadow of digital hegemony. Despite the great power rivalry that we have seen from China and the United States, mid-power countries do have important roles to play in shaping the digital futures of not only in their countries, but also on a much more regional or global scale, as we have seen from, for example, EU, Japan, and countries like Australia and more. The two papers, as you have noted, one, the one by Venki and Saraju on India's payment system, and the paper that we just heard on India and Brazil as middle power countries provide really interesting insight on the intricate link between digital technology and digital economy. Next, let me invite Saraju to provide a brief commentary on this latest paper that we just heard. Thank you.
Thank you, Min, and thank you, Luca. Thanks for the wonderful paper, Vash. It was really fascinating to read and also hear you talk about it. I'm going to sort of keep the comments brief for now, and hopefully we can have a longer discussion, just given how many threads I see in common between both our papers. And this is certainly hopefully the start of a longer conversation. Like Min said, this is indeed very exciting work. It is important to think about sovereignty from the perspective of middle powers, quite critical at this moment, quite significantly because a lot of the debate is framed from the Western lens, and therefore unpacking it from the view of countries such as India, Brazil, and more broadly the BRICS countries is very timely and necessary. I think also this kind of literature is crucial, not just from the lens of scholarship. I think it's also necessary from the perspective of policy, and I think you do talk about it at different parts of in different parts in the paper. So there is a need to understand what sort of the repertoire of strategies available to middle powers looks like, and frame it within a theoretical construct. So again, very, very interesting. Also, I think my excitement is partly personal. It speaks very much to some of the concepts we try to unpack in our paper. And again, this is something, our paper focuses on digital payments. So I guess it's fortuitous that Venki dropped off so that his paper follows yours rather than precedes it. Just a couple of thoughts, which I thought were interesting strands and would love to see them built upon in a future iteration of this paper. The first is the idea of sovereignty itself. I think, like Min said, it's something that's being evolved by the actions of middle powers very significantly as much as the West. So seeing how it's being expressed in narrative terms in addition to policy articulations might be an interesting adjunct or a thread to explore, subject to the constraints of the paper. I think, and this is from the lens of India, this is certainly a very important consideration. There's a huge narrative aspect to the way digital sovereignty is framed. So thinking through that as an adjunct to the policy question is quite relevant. The second, I think, is related, but to more overtly grapple with the political aspects of this framing of digital sovereignty. At least in India, several right-wing semi-political institutions, trade bodies, actively affiliated to political parties are very actively embedded in the debate around digital sovereignty and particularly data localization. In part, and you call that out in your paper very well, because they see this as a way to counter monopolies from Western companies, but being able to talk through how and why these interest groups enact their interests might be an additional adjunct to the paper worth considering. I think the other, a slight theoretical point almost is to say, is there a way to more overtly engage with the ideas of sovereignty itself? Because what digital does is it overlays a traditional political science concept with both sort of technological power as well as the geopolitics of today. So being able to grapple with some frame around sovereignty and then embedding data localization within it might also be an interesting pathway to consider. I think the last, of course, I mean, all of our papers are draft papers, and I think thinking through or articulating, at least, I come from the lens of a policy and a policy practitioner, is articulating a little more sharply who the audience for the paper is. I think this kind of work spans sort of, like I said, both scholarly conversations as well as everyday quotidian political policy ones. So I feel like being able to call that out either as, this is an audience or as or in terms of the framing would be very, very interesting to read. But overall, I'm fascinated. I really read the paper in one go, and it's been a long time since my doctoral days that I did that. So thank you very much for your paper. Back to you, Min.
Thank you so much, Sarayu. Really excellent comments. And we're delighted now that Venki is back onto the internet. Welcome back to the internet, Venki. The floor is handed over to you right now.
Okay. Luca, can you share the presentation?
Luca has left the room to allow for streaming capacity, but we would ask the staff kindly to share these slides.
Okay. So while the slides are coming up, I'll just quickly walk people through why we chose payments as the core area to focus on. As many people know, in India, we have built public digital infrastructure for payments, for identity and data. Of that, there's been much that has been written about on the Aadhaar, which is the unique biometric ID, but not much has been written on the payment side. we have in India built something called the Unified Payment Interface, which is one of the most modern payment instruments in the world. It enables mobile to mobile funds transfer, instantaneous transfers, and it's a very, very efficient kind of a payment infrastructure. Last month, the number of transactions were about 2.3 billion transactions in a month. And it has been growing extremely fast, almost about 20% month on month. It is, I think, considered to be about the fifth largest payment network in the world. And this is from a standing start in 2016. So we thought that there is a practical example that we can look at, and a practical example that would be relevant to policymakers around the world. And I think the 2014 sanctions that the US imposed on Russia kind of brings the importance of payments and digital sovereignty in payments in sharp relief, because ultimately payments are the lifeblood of an economy. So in 2014, when the sanctions were imposed on Russia, MasterCard and Visa were the two largest payment networks in Russia, and with almost about 90% of the market share. So when those sanctions were imposed, millions of Russians couldn't transact using their credit cards. Ultimately, Russia responded by creating its own credit card called Mir, and subsequently they started asking payment networks to be registered in country. So that kind of brings the issue of digital sovereignty into sharp relief. For our paper, we looked at Paul and Thornton's definition of digital sovereignty, which has got three parts to it. The first is state autonomy and the security of national infrastructure. The second is economic autonomy and competition for actors within the territory. And the third is autonomy and individual self-determination for citizens. So we looked at the UPI and evaluated whether it meets these criteria. So a little bit about the unified payment interface. It's a very easy to use smartphone based payment interface. So the way I make a payment to somebody is like I send an email to someone. So my personal virtual payment address is vh@ICICI. And if I am to make a payment to Sarayu, I would just maybe use a virtual payment ID like Sarayu at Axis Bank. So any UPI player, any player within the network can instantaneously send money to each other. And today there are about 224 banks which are on the network. So it's a highly interoperable payment network. From a policy perspective, this is highly relevant for countries that do not have card networks right now. It's also extremely relevant for countries that have growing telecom penetration and smartphone penetration. What is also very interesting is that the National Payment Corporation of India is set up as a non-profit. And I think this has got very important implications. It is set up as a non-profit and it charges utility payments. When it comes to UPI, there are no transaction fees as such right now because the government has decreed that there will be no transaction fees on UPI. So this kind of a pricing enables faster financial inclusion. And there are many other factors about UPI which enable financial inclusion, because unlike a card infrastructure, there is no point of sale terminals and the monthly recurring costs and the initial purchase price of the point of sale terminal. If I'm a merchant on the UPI network, I just need to print out a QR code. And what that means is that when customer comes and buys using that QR code, the money is immediately credited to my bank account. So when we look at Paul and Thornton's framework and look at state autonomy, economic autonomy, and competition, and individual self-determination for citizens, what we find is that because UPI is housed in the territory of India and controlled by Indian banks, a denial of technology regime like what happened in Russia will have a negligible impact on India. From an autonomy and competition perspective, there are 224 banks on the network. So if I want to switch from one network to the other, my switching costs are extremely low. It just means that I give up my uh, virtual payment address that's been created with ICICI Bank and use another payment address when I download another bank app. So what that means is basically that I can instantaneously switch from one virtual payment address to the other. And at the back end, it's connected to my bank account. So my money keeps coming into my bank account. The barrier to entry for new banks and new third-party services providers is also very low. Anybody can sign up with a bank and set up a UPI app. Any bank can come up and say, I want to be part of the UPI ecosystem and connect to the UPI backend. So that enables people to join the network, be part of it extremely quickly. And finally, in terms of individual self-determination. For merchants, as I explained earlier, it's very easy to be a part of this network. The other part is that unlike card networks, the settlement terms are immediate. Card networks usually have maybe around a week or so of settlement. So for all these reasons, it has been very, very quickly adopted within India. The policy takeaways from this for countries outside India would be things like interoperability. I think one advantage of UPI is that NPCI hosts the UPI backend. So therefore, interoperability is kind of baked into the ecosystem from day one. And this is very different from China because Alibaba and WeChat became large players, and then the government realized that you need to enforce interoperability, and then they brought in post facto regulations. This is possible for a country like China, which has got immense state power, but it may not be possible for other countries which do not have that kind of enforcement capability. So interoperability is something that policymakers have to keep in mind. The second would be multi-stakeholder governance. In India right now, the banks are the shareholders of the National Payment Corporation of India. There is very little input from civil society on the governing board of the National Payment Corporation. So having more representation from participants from civil society who work on privacy, financial inclusion, etc., might be a good thing. The third recommendation would be that these kind of networks should be set up in other countries, potentially as a non-profit consortium with in-country ownership, so that digital sovereignty can be preserved. The fourth is that institutional checks and balances should be instituted. Currently, the National Payment Corporation of India is outside the remit of the Right to Information Act. And many activists have raised the fact that this is, UPI is run as public digital infrastructure, but is outside the ambit of these kind of infrastructure, which is, I think, a valid point. The fifth is, I think, there needs to be regular reviews and risk mitigation analysis. At this point in time, the NPCI has said that from a perspective of minimizing the risk of players becoming too big to fail, they have instituted a cap of about 30%, which is the maximum level that any one particular payment app can reach up to. Currently, the fact of the matter is that Google Pay and Phone Pay, which is owned by Walmart, are the two biggest players with almost about 90% of the market share, which is because they have spent a huge amount of money in acquiring market power. So the NPCI felt that it's too risky. There is enormous systemic risk in these players becoming too important and have brought in this kind of a cap. So, we find that these kind of networks would be of immense relevance in other parts of the world, especially ones where there is smartphone penetration and mobile phone penetration. And I think we are seeing that there is about 20 countries which have expressed an interest in building a UPI kind of ecosystem in their own countries. I think this is relevant because in most countries, card payment networks are not that prevalent, and this enables those countries to leapfrog one generation of technology to another. And therefore, these policy recommendations might be of interest to those countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Venki, for your insightful comments and information, and for jumping back and presenting without the slides. And thank you very much. And let me give the floor quickly to Vash to make brief comments. In the interest of time, I hope we can keep our comments short so that we can conclude the session on time. Thank you.
Thank you, Venkatesh, and thank you, Dr. Jiang. Okay, so I have very quickly a couple of comments that I absolutely love this paper, and I think it was waiting to happen to sort of put the debate around NPCI within the context of digital sovereignty and digital statecraft. I think the paper argues very well why NPCI is a key element of India's digital sovereignty. I mean, without NPCI, India would be light years behind when it comes to digital sovereignty. So this was an absolutely eye-opening paper. I loved it. That being said, so I had a couple of things where I would like you to sort of press on. One of the things that I've been thinking about is while the UPI allows India a measure of digital sovereignty, in fact, the presence of foreign platforms on UPI, as you said, PhonePe and Google Pay, could in fact undermine India's digital sovereignty when coupled with the small finance bank licenses that are planning to be issued by the Reserve Bank of India, as well as the new 74% FDI limits in insurance. And so the same digital public good that allowed India to gain digital sovereignty, in fact, could be turned because of the effects of other policies into diminishing India's sovereignty, right? A small finance bank license in the hands of Walmart would effectively foreignize India's banking system to an unprecedented level, which I know it's not the central core of your argument, but would be interesting to flesh out. And I know you've talked about NUE, so I'm not going to go into that. The second thing that I wanted that was interesting was a focus on sort of India's extraterritoriality of UPI, which is, we just noticed that Bhutan has latched onto the UPI network, meaning that, if UPI is adopted by at least a few other countries in India's neighborhood, UPI can act as the MasterCard and Visa for India. So in fact, what India is trying to prevent onto itself, UPI can, at some given later date, turn into something what India can affect onto others. So from a defensive state point to an offensive state point. The second is I really would have loved to see a little bit of discussion between the economic concepts of efficiency and resiliency. And you guys kind of mentioned it, but a deeper insight into that, UPI is not supplanting Master and Visa. It's not upturning the liberal world order, but rather it's creating a space for India within it. It's not as in China where, Master and Visa don't work. It's all Union Pay, right? It's not like that, but it rather gives some sort of resiliency, builds resiliency into India's statecraft. Those are the three larger points that I wanted to say. Otherwise, I really enjoyed the paper, and thank you so much for presenting it.
Thanks, Vash. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vash. And in the interest of time, we'll quickly move to our next presenter. That will be Francesca. And our next speaker is Francesca Musiani, Associate Research Professor at the French National Center for Scientific Research. She's the lead author of a group paper titled The Many Faces of Technology Embedded Power and Resistance in Russia Towards the Infrastructure-Based Sociology of Russian Internet. Francesca, the floor is yours.
So thank you so much. I have just attempted to share the presentation. I'm not sure if you can see it yet. I'm being told it's being shared by the platform. It worked earlier on. Okay, great. Wonderful. So let me share the whole thing. So yeah, thank you so much, Min and Luca, for the invitation to this panel and for the invitation into the book project. So I'm really happy to present this this chapter today, which is very much a collective chapter by the team of our research project called Resistic, which has been working for more than 3 years now, COVID allowing, and it's made of 10 members, and it's examining broadly taken, like all its different axes. It's examining how different actors of the Russian internet resist and adapt to the recent wave of regulations that are both leaning towards authoritarian and centralizing tendencies. And we focus in particular on the forms of online resistance that reveal a number of social practices and techniques for circumventing online constraints that are so far perhaps lesser known. And so our starting point is really this context of recent history of the Russian internet that has seen Russian authorities actively move towards this autonomization and sovereignization of their national internet. This has happened through a number of new laws aimed at countering foreign influences and agents, as well as the devices and applications that are born outside of Russia. So two emblematic examples of these laws have been the sovereign internet law and the anti-Apple law. These are not the official denominations, of course, but this is what they have become known as in media and in several policy discussions. So our chapters focus here.
Francesca, sorry, we can't see the presentation. I wonder if you could switch back to.
Really?
No. Yeah. No.
Okay, so I'm going to stop this and try to share it again. I guess it happened when I tried to put the full screen. Let me try this again. Otherwise, I'm just going to speak. But
exactly, before full screen, it was working.
Okay, so now it's.
Yes, it's working now.
Now we can see it.
No, not now.
No, not anymore.
Okay, sorry. So I think that I'm going to try one last time, and
we might try without the full screen, just the slides.
Yes, actually, I have stopped the full screen mode, but it has not stopped in the platform. Actually, apparently, I'm going to try one last time. Do you see something now? Okay, should be. Okay, so I'm going to refrain from the full screen. So this particular chapter's focus is the extent to which these control and circumvention strategies that we've been examining in the project are embedded into and or conducted by means of the infrastructure of the Russian internet. So what we have tried to do here is to paint in broad strokes, because the principle of these chapters has been to bring together all our different field works within the project with this focus, is to undertake this what we've called this infrastructure-based sociology of the RUNET, so focusing on the technical devices and the assets that are involved in surveillance and censorship on the governance part on one hand, and on the strategies of resistance and circumvention carried out by infrastructure that follow as a response to these governmental strategies. So this empirical core of the chapter has been is an overview of a number of studies that we have undertaken since the project started in early 2018. This chapter also has somewhat of a prelude to all these empirical cases, in which we, Valery Kosov, who is the legal scholar of the team, has outlined the particular relationship that exists in Russia for the past few years between law and infrastructure as means of control, and he examines what are the specificities of how it has taken shape in the Russian context in the past few years. Then we have this this central part that is about insights from the field that trace this portrait of sovereignization and resistance by infrastructure in the Russian internet. So we look at 6 cases that we examine in about 1 to 2 pages each. So the first one is about the strategies of internet service providers in the Russian internet as a response to the number of requirements that oblige them to install a number of middle boxes and other technical artifacts in their equipment for surveillance purposes. The second case is about retracing the controversy of the surrounding the Telegram ban and the implication of this controversy that has taken place between mid 2018 to mid 2020. The consequences of this ban and of the controversy it ensues for infrastructural dependency in Russia and resistant practices. Then there is a case about Yandex News, which is a news aggregator that is, well, Yandex is also a search engine that is connected to it. So we, Françoise Dossé and Benjamin Leveluc have looked at how official news ratings have been prompted by the Russian government, and how circumvention strategies have been implemented to prevent these ratings from being like the only version of news ratings that Russia sees. Then there is a case on how the online, the repression of local environmental movements is carried out as a sovereignization process via social networks, and in particular here Perrine Poupin has examined the case of VKontakte in an uprising in the Chies region about a waste landfill that has been built there. Then a case by Olga Bronikova and Anna Zaitseva looks at how, surprisingly and perhaps counterintuitively so, Google and more broadly the United States-based net giants are seen by several activist communities in Russia as a recommendable tools in RUNET digital security practices. The main reason, well, it's pretty complicated and outlined in the paper, but the main reason is that the main challenge by this community of activists is seen as the state, not as the Western perception might be the actors, the private actors themselves, and the challenges they may pose to the protection of personal data, for example. And so there are some interesting shifts to consider there. And finally, there is a case about shadow libraries in Russia and how they have been built as knowledge disseminators, alternative knowledge disseminators, due to increasing restrictions on freedom of expression and content sharing in Russia. So examine the ways in which they have been conforming partly to this legislation, and on the other hand, how they have been circumventing some of these constraints in order to survive. So in the conclusions, we try to highlight 4 recurring dynamics in this current attempt by the Russian state to enforce digital sovereignty by means of the Russian internet infrastructure, as well as in circumvention and evasion strategies that are enacted by different communities and individuals. The first being that the Russian government seeks in a variety of ways to raise a series of obstacles against foreign techniques and alternative infrastructures that are considered as a subversive. The second aspect is that in almost all the cases we can observe collateral damage that rises in different ways and results from the technical implementation of these measures. And so we can observe infrastructure-based measures and attempts to remedy or mitigate this collateral damage. We observe as well the creation and the development of new digital nation champions that are put under government supervision, supervision that is increasingly close. This leads to pressures and manipulations by the state on particular platforms and their algorithms. We can see this with Yandex in particular, for example, and also to counter moves that can be, as mentioned, surprising from the standpoint of a Europe or United States-based scholars. For example, the ways in which American net giants are seen more as powerful actors that are able to stand up to the Russian government rather than a possible threat in themselves. And finally, we witnessed an emergence of critique and circumvention initiatives among internet users vis-a-vis this governance by infrastructure, and these reactions contribute to the emergence of new forms of resistance by infrastructure. So with this approach by case studies, we try to provide to increase the level of nuancing the understanding of the specificities of Russian internet governance. And the reason is also that Russia itself describes its internet governance style currently as a strictly centralized, top-down, and efficient information control system. So we try to see all the gaps in this image, and so we pay attention to these micro techniques of circumvention, and we show how the discourse on internet sovereignty, as well as the demand that information control technologies are made in Russia, actually opens up a number of technical and legal opportunities for resistance at the mundane and everyday level, and the existence of some parallel RUNETs where particular instantiations of informational freedom can still be possible. So thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions. And the chapter is shared in the folder provided by Min and Luca, but I'm happy to share it further if needed, and looking forward to Tele's comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francesca, for the presentation of your group's work. In the interest of time, may I suggest that actually we reserve the comments for each other since we're trading comments between ourselves, but rather I would invite next actually Talis to present his work. If we still have time at the end, we'll have a chance to provide comments for each other. Thank you. So our next and the final speaker of the panel is Talis Thomas, who's researcher and lecturer in media policy and media economics in the Department of Communication Studies at the University of Salzburg. His presentation is titled Resistance to Platformized Opinion Power on the Absence of the BRICS in Federated Social Networking. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Min, and thanks, Luca, for the invitation to participate here. Sorry, Francesca, not having the opportunity to comment your wonderful paper, what I wish to do later. But yeah, in interest of time, I will have to go straight forward to my presentation. It's shared, but I see that it's not on the screen yet. Should I do anything more here? Okay, now it is. I am interested in this paper in understanding how activism in federated social media in the Global South, in the BRICS, and more specifically in Brazil, how this activism is understanding and is dealing with the idea and concept of digital sovereignty. This is a kind of activism that pushes the idea that we have to have the freedom to use, to examine, to modify, and to share computer programs. And the political idea behind this freedom is that this technical materiality that pervades our daily lives, it should also be politicized, because it's not only the content that we transmit through these technical materialities that matter, but these materialities themselves, they can shape how these ideas are expressed and circulated. So they have also to be a matter of politics. So this is the idea why activism of free software pushes its agenda forward. I argue in my paper that this resembles in many aspects what scholars of digital sovereignty regard as digital sovereignty discourses, namely forms of independence, control, and autonomy over digital infrastructure, technologies, and data. And here in my paper, I rely I draw especially on the approach by Couture and Tupan and Paul and Thiel. In this approach, they argue that these sovereignty discourses, they have usually, although they all have this common framework of autonomy, independence, they have different actors which might play different roles, usually 3 sets of actors: governments, market players, and civil society. And Coutu and Tupan, and I use their categorization for this, they argue that there are then 5 types of discourses that rearrange these actors in a certain manner. And force activism, this activism in free software, it's associated in these descriptions with social movements, digital sovereignty discourse, and personal digital sovereignty discourses. So we have this kind of sovereignty discourses. We have force participating in these discourses, which put civil society as the actor which should enjoy freedom, autonomy, sovereignty. And not so much state, and not so much the cyberspace itself as in other discourses. But then I argued that we have to consider also some nuances in this regard, because force activism, free software activism, has historically also had many relations to libertarian values, libertarian ideas, which are present in other kinds of digital sovereignty discourse, namely cyberspace discourses. On the other hand, there is also force activism as part of the role of the state in establishing technological autonomy and independence. This has appeared in Europe as well. But a special role has been played by the Global South in this kind of discourse. we have many scholars arguing that global South countries would have to rely more on open source software, free and open source software, in order to really exert control over their infrastructure. And Brazil has played a leading role in this respect, in this regard. This makes a study of current Brazilian activism in this field even more interesting. This specific instantiation of force activism refers to social media activities. We know that social media have evolved to this model of corporate social media platforms, and this has raised also digital sovereignty concerns, and force activism has reacted to this. Concerns have been made both at the individual level, personal level, because of the control that big tech has acquired over our personal data, but also at the societal level, as sovereign nation states, media industry, they perceive a loss of control over content and again, control handled over a few companies, mostly American companies. Then the reaction by force activism has been to push for federated social media. This means social media which operate with open and interoperable protocols and software, so allowing users from one social media to reach users from other social media, and trying this way to break up with these walled gardens. That is also the core of the business model of these big techs. This way, force activists, they strive for decentralized governance of data, so undermining control by a single entity, by allowing several centers to have their own governance of data. And some authors here, I rely on Mansu and Abin, they argue also that this approach represents also a change in the history of force activism, because there is here a shift from technical to social understanding of privacy. So with this decentralization, we have privacy determined not by technical features, but by the users either operating the servers or using these social media. And we also have something different from a historical development of force, and this is the idea of a limit of openness. Historically, force has simply welcomed open as a value-free thing that we should always embrace. And here, the idea is that there is federation, but not only federation, but also the contrary, defederation. So we have this counter position of openness that is legitimate in open source software in this activism. So considering this difference, considering that this is a new development in force activism, I would like to see also if the activism in the Global South, and in my case studying Brazil, also has a different conception of digital sovereignty in comparison to the historical ambiguity of force. And for this, I have talked to administrators and moderators of Brazilian social media which operate under this concept. And what I got from these conversations and from the observation of what they do on federated social media, on Mastodon, the software that I chose as my main object, is that they have a very clear narrative of sovereignty, in other words, of who has control and who should have control over the digital social media. And in this narrative, market power is regarded as the main adversary and not the state. So driving a bit away from these cyber libertarian discourses, which saw the state as the main enemy. And they understand accordingly this power as having to move to the social movements themselves. They acknowledge the necessity of the participation of the state. They support regulation of big tech, especially bringing transparency over their business models and their workings, and in promoting open source alternatives. But on the other hand, they do not support strong measures of state sovereignty, such as data localization or publicly funded social networking, a similar alternative to public service media, for example. And in their view, federated social media, especially Mastodon, contributes to a certain extent, but it's not a silver bullet, to this decentralization, contributes to this sovereignty with decentralization and with the rejection of algorithmic curation, and so placing the responsibility for moderation on people themselves and not on tech. However, I find also that although the Global South might have a clear narrative and some interesting ideas regarding force activism, it's lagging behind and federate social media. I have here a table that shows that 80% of federated social media and their active users are located in 4 countries. These are 4 rich countries: United States, France, Germany, and Japan. Global South is almost not represented at all. I have found that an additional difficulty for the Global South to shape this movement is because despite the attempts of decentralization, it is still the benevolent dictator for life model, a centralized development that occurs in many projects of free software, and because of the overwhelming majority of Anglo-American white people which are present in these networks, driving away marginalized groups. Besides this, I have realized that this activism also lacks some understanding of the geopolitical dimensions of technological power. And so sometimes I could see some naivety, so to say, regarding it's not important that the state does something stronger to protect the rights of their population. If the social movements themselves could code solutions through the federated social media, this would be almost sufficient. So wrapping up this thing, I see that Brazilian Fediverse activism has a well-organized and politicized narrative that distances from cyber-libertarian accounts. And so it's way more specific sovereignty narrative, but at the same time that the Global South lacks capacity of shaping this universe of federated social media, and lacks also understanding of the geopolitical dimensions of power imbalances. Sorry for my very fast presentation. I hope you could grasp the core of it, and I'm available for further conversations. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Talis, for your very interesting work on the diverse conceptualizations of digital sovereignty, as well as the potential of federated social networking from an activist perspective. I profusely apologize for the, for not being able to hear the comments from Francesca and Tails for each other's papers in the interest of time. I apologize, we went slightly over time. However, To conclude, I want to thank all the panelists for your excellent presentations and comments. We also want to thank the conference organizer and staff, as well as our audience who joined from across the world. We hope our edited book volume on digital sovereignty in BRICS countries will be released next year. So please feel free to get in touch with any of us on this panel should our work interest you. Again, thank you everyone for a great panel. Take good care wherever you are. Ciao, ciao.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.